You know, there's something wild about watching a bunch of music critics absolutely tear apart what would become one of the most important songs in hip hop history. Picture this: January 1981. A platinum selling rock band fronted by a blonde woman from New York decides to rap on national television, and half the country thinks they've lost their minds. The other half? They're too busy laughing to notice they're witnessing history. But here's the thing about Rapture by Blondie. What seemed like the punchline to a bad joke in 1981 turned into something nobody saw coming, and the story of how it got there involves everything from downtown Manhattan art shows to a guy dressed as Grandmaster Flash, walking around eating cars with his mind. Yeah, you heard that right. Let's rewind to 1980, because you can't understand Rapture without understanding where Debbie Harry and Chris Stein were coming from. Blondie had just come off two massive number one hits with Call Me and Heart of Glass. They were everywhere. MTV wasn't even a thing yet, but Debbie Harry's face was plastered across every magazine from Rolling Stone to fashion rags that had never cared about rock music before. Most bands in that position would play it safe, right? Pump out another disco rock hybrid, cash the checks, call it a day. But Harry and Stein were spending their nights at a club called the Mud Club in Tribeca, and later at spots like Negril and Danceteria, watching something completely different unfold. Hip hop was exploding in the Bronx and starting to creep into downtown Manhattan, and these two were absolutely mesmerized. The downtown scene in 1980 was unlike anything that had come before it. You had punk rockers mixing with artists, graffiti writers hanging out with poets, musicians collaborating with painters. The old boundaries between different kinds of art and different kinds of people were breaking down. This wasn't the buttoned up art world of uptown galleries, and it wasn't the segregated music scene where everyone stayed in their lane. This was chaos in the best possible way. Chris Stein was a photographer in addition to being a musician, and he documented this scene obsessively. He'd snap pictures at parties, at clubs, on the street. Years later, these photos would become valuable historical documents, showing people like Basquiat and Keith Haring and other future legends just hanging out, being young, being broke, being creative. But at the time, Stein wasn't thinking about posterity. He was just capturing his friends, his world. Debbie Harry was soaking it all in too, but in a different way. She'd watch the performers at these clubs, the way the MCs commanded attention, the way the crowd responded to the beats. She was fascinated by the energy, the spontaneity, the way hip hop felt dangerous and exciting in a way that rock music, even punk rock, didn't anymore. Rock had become establishment. Hip hop was still underground, still rebellious, still hungry. Now, here's what made them different from other rock musicians at the time: they weren't tourists. Stein and Harry genuinely loved this music. They'd go see Fab Five Freddy throw art shows where graffiti artists like Lee Quinones would paint, and DJs would spin breaks, and MCs would rock the crowd. This wasn't research for them. This was their scene, their friends, their New York. Fab Five Freddy, who was basically the ambassador between the downtown art world and the uptown hip hop scene, became close friends with them. He'd later say that Harry and Stein got it in a way that most white musicians didn't. They understood that hip hop wasn't just music, it was a whole culture, a movement, something revolutionary happening right under everyone's noses. So when Blondie went into the studio to record their fifth album, Auto American, in 1980, nobody should have been surprised that they wanted to experiment. Except everyone was. The band had already proven they could jump genres, everything from punk to disco to reggae, but rap? That was something else entirely. The sessions for Rapture started with the instrumental track. Producer Mike Chapman and the band built this funky, bass-heavy groove that borrowed heavily from the breaks and beats they'd been hearing at clubs. Chris Stein's guitar work was sparse and rhythmic, nothing like traditional rock. The drums, played by Clem Burke, locked into a hip-hop pocket that white rock bands simply weren't doing in 1980. Getting that groove right took time. Chapman, who'd produced hit after hit for Blondie and other bands, was stepping into unfamiliar territory. He was a rock producer trying to capture a hip-hop feel, and that required unlearning some of his instincts. The track needed space, needed to breathe in a way that rock production didn't usually allow. They spent hours getting the bass line just right, making sure it had that bounce, that pocket that made people want to move. Nigel Harrison played bass on the track, and his part was crucial. It couldn't sound too busy, too rock and roll. It had to have that repetitive, hypnotic quality that hip hop was built on. They'd bring in cassette tapes of songs they'd heard at clubs, studying the bass lines, trying to understand what made them work. This was before hip hop production was codified, before there were rule books for how to do this. They were figuring it out as they went. Jimmy Destry's keyboard work added these weird, futuristic textures that gave the song its otherworldly quality. It wasn't traditional hip hop instrumentation, but it worked because it created this sonic landscape that matched the surreal lyrics Harry was writing. The song existed in its own space, not quite rock, not quite hip hop, something new and strange. But the real question was, what would Debbie Harry do vocally? And this is where things get interesting because Harry didn't try to sound like an MC from the Bronx. She didn't try to fake an accent or imitate someone else's style. She wrote these surrealist downtown New York lyrics that name-dropped Fab Five Freddy and mentioned graffiti and fashion and this bizarre science fiction story about a man from Mars eating cars and guitars. When she recorded it, she delivered the rap verses in her own voice, with her own cadence, slightly breathless and conversational, like she was telling you a story at a party. It wasn't technically perfect hip-hop MCing, but that wasn't the point. It was authentic to who she was, and it captured something about the collision of these different New York scenes that a more technically proficient approach might have missed. The lyrics themselves were pure downtown weirdness. Harry rapped about going out to the parking lot, about getting in a car that didn't work, about fashion and passion mixing up. Then suddenly there's this character, the man from Mars, and he's eating cars and bars and guitars, and now he's heading to the Mud Club, but nobody wants him there because he's too hip. It made absolutely no sense and perfect sense at the same time, if you were part of that scene. And then came the name drops. Fab Five. Freddie told him everybody's fly, DJ's spinning, MCs are busy, and just the music's for the real. She mentioned Grandmaster Flash saying he might rock the disco scene. For a lot of white mainstream radio listeners, these were the first hip-hop names they'd ever heard. Think about that for a second. The first time millions of Americans heard about Grandmaster Flash was from a white rock singer who looked like Marilyn Monroe. But here's what made it revolutionary. Harry wasn't mocking these artists or treating them like a novelty. She was celebrating them, putting their names in her song the same way rock bands had been name-checking their influences forever. It was a gesture of respect, of saying these artists matter. They're part of the conversation now. Still, when Rapture came out in January 1981, the immediate reaction was mixed, to put it mildly. Rock critics didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was a gimmick, Blondie trying too hard to stay relevant by latching onto whatever was trendy. Radio programmers were confused about whether it was even playable. And the general public? A lot of people thought it was funny in a bad way. The early reviews called it everything from experimental to embarrassing. People made jokes about a white woman trying to rap, about how awkward it sounded, about how this was clearly Blondie jumping the shark. Late-night TV hosts did bits about it. The song became an easy target for anyone who thought rock music should stay in its lane. Remember, this was 1981. Hip-hop hadn't crossed over yet. Most Americans, especially white Americans outside of major cities, had never heard rap music before. The Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight had come out in 1979 and had some success, but it was still considered a novelty record by most people. The idea that rap was a legitimate art form, that it would still be around in 40 years, seemed absurd to most music industry people at the time. So when Blondie, a successful rock band, put out a song with rap verses, it felt to many people like a joke, like that time your dad tries to use slang and gets it all wrong. The cultural gap was enormous. The white rock audience didn't understand hip-hop, didn't see the skill involved, didn't get why anyone would want to talk rhythmically over a beat instead of singing a proper melody. It seemed primitive to them, like a step backward for music. But something strange started happening. Despite all the mockery, despite all the critics wringing their hands about genre mixing, Rapture started climbing the charts. And it kept climbing. By March 1981, it hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making it the first song featuring rap vocals to ever reach the top of the charts. The success caught everyone off guard. Radio stations that had been reluctant to play it suddenly had it in heavy rotation. MTV, which had launched in August of that year, played the video constantly. People who'd initially dismissed the song found themselves humming it, found themselves unable to get that groove out of their heads. The Man from Mars eating cars became a cultural reference point. Kids at schools were trying to rap along with Debbie Harry's verses. Now, the hip-hop community's reaction to all this was complicated, and rightfully so. Here was this massive breakthrough moment for rap music, but it was being delivered by a white rock band. Some hip-hop pioneers felt conflicted about it. On one hand, it was bringing attention to their culture, introducing their names to millions of people who'd never heard of them. On the other hand, why did it take a white face to get rap on mainstream radio when black artists had been perfecting this art form for years? This tension wasn't new. It was the same story that had played out with rock and roll in the 50s, with jazz before that, with blues before that. White artists taking black musical innovations, making them palatable for white audiences, and reaping the commercial rewards while the originators struggled for recognition and respect. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Grandmaster Flash himself had mixed feelings initially. He appreciated the shout-out, and he recognized that Harry and Stein genuinely respected the culture, but there was still something bittersweet about the fact that his name was becoming known to mainstream America through someone else's song rather than his own music. He'd been perfecting his craft for years, revolutionizing DJing, creating techniques that would influence generations of musicians, and now he was famous because a rock singer mentioned him in a song. At the same time, Flash understood the realities of the music industry. He knew that hip-hop needed allies, needed people with platforms who were willing to take risks and introduce this music to new audiences. And he could see that Harry and Stein weren't trying to steal anything or claim credit they didn't deserve. They were fans who wanted to help, even if the help came with complicated implications. Other hip-hop artists were more skeptical. Some saw Rapture as exploitation, pure and simple. A white band making money off black culture, getting played on radio stations that wouldn't touch actual hip-hop artists. The fact that the song went to number 1 while genuine hip-hop records struggled to get any mainstream attention felt like proof that the music industry was fundamentally racist, that it would always prefer white performers even when they were imitating black art forms. Fab Five Freddy, who appeared in the music video and was close friends with the band, defended Rapture publicly. He saw it as a bridge, a way to get more people interested in hip-hop, who might then seek out the real deal. And he was right about that. Record store owners reported that after Rapture hit big, customers started asking for hip-hop records, many of them for the first time ever. The music video for Rapture deserves its own chapter in this story because it became just as important as the song itself. When MTV launched in August of 1981, Rapture was in heavy rotation, and it became one of the first videos to feature hip-hop culture on the channel. The video was directed by an artist named Stephen R. Johnson, and it captured that downtown New York vibe perfectly. The video showed Debbie Harry rapping on a street in the East Village with the band performing in what looked like a club or loft space. But the real magic was in the details. You had graffiti artists, you had dancers doing moves that would later become more widely known as hip-hop dance. You had Fab Five Freddy making an appearance as a DJ. And you had Jean-Michel Basquiat, who would go on to become one of the most important artists of the 20th century, playing a silent DJ in the background. Most people watching MTV in 1981 had no idea who Basquiat was, and they wouldn't for a few more years. But there he was, this young graffiti artist and painter, just part of the scenery in a Blondie video. It's one of those things that seems almost impossible now. like spotting a future legend before anyone knew they were legendary. Basquiat's story itself is worth pausing on for a moment. In 1981, he was still trying to make it as an artist, still sleeping on friends' couches sometimes, still struggling. He'd been part of the graffiti duo Samo, tagging cryptic phrases around downtown Manhattan. He was making paintings, trying to get gallery shows, existing in that uncertain space where you don't know if you're going to become successful or just stay broke and unknown forever. The Rapture video was just another gig for him, a way to make a little money and be part of something cool. He probably had no idea that decades later people would be studying that footage, analyzing his presence, seeing it as a snapshot of an artist on the verge of greatness. His paintings would eventually sell for millions, but in 1981 he was just Gene, Chris, and Debbie's friend who made interesting art. The video also featured this surreal sequence with the Man from Mars character that Harry sings about, played by a performer in this bizarre alien costume eating toy cars. It was weird and artsy and not at all what mainstream music videos looked like at the time. MTV played it constantly anyway, partly because they needed content in those early days and partly because it was genuinely compelling to watch. The aesthetic of the video influenced a generation of music video directors. That mix of performance, narrative, surrealism, and street culture became a template. You can see echoes of it in everything from Michael Jackson's videos to contemporary hip-hop visuals. The video proved you could be artsy and weird and still connect with a mass audience, that you didn't have to dumb things down to be successful. What happened next changed everything, though it took a while for people to realize it. Rapture opened doors. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. Radio stations that had played Rapture and seen it do well started being more willing to play other songs with rap elements. Record executives who dismissed hip-hop as a fad started paying attention. MTV viewers who'd seen the Rapture video started seeking out more information about this culture they'd glimpsed. The mechanism was simple but powerful. Rapture had proven that songs with rap vocals could be commercially successful. That's all the music industry needed to know. Suddenly, hip-hop artists had a counter-argument when label executives told them rap would never sell. They could point to Rapture and say, look, it went to #1. If people will buy a rock band rapping, imagine what they'll do for the real thing. It wasn't just about the charts either. The song legitimized hip-hop in the eyes of people who might have otherwise dismissed it. Your suburban white kids whose parents bought them the Blondie album were now asking questions about Grandmaster Flash and Fab Five Freddy. They wanted to know more about this culture that Debbie Harry clearly thought was cool. That curiosity led them down paths they might never have traveled otherwise. By 1982, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five released The Message, and it broke through to mainstream audiences in a way that might not have been possible a year earlier. The song went gold and got played on rock radio stations, something that would have been unthinkable before Rapture. Africa Bambaataa Planet Rock came out the same year and became a crossover hit. The floodgates were starting to open. Record labels started signing hip-hop artists, not just as novelties, but as legitimate acts with career potential. Radio formats started making room for rap. Music journalists started taking hip-hop seriously, writing about it as an art form rather than a passing fad. The culture was moving from the margins to the mainstream, and Rapture had been one of the first dominoes to fall. Throughout the 80s, hip-hop grew exponentially, moving from underground phenomenon to mainstream force. Run DMC, LL Cool J, Public Enemy, NWA, they all built on ground that had been broken by those early crossover moments. And Rapture was right there at the beginning of that process, whether people wanted to admit it or not. The debate about Rapture's place in hip-hop history has never really stopped. Some people argue it shouldn't count as the first rap song to hit #1 because Debbie Harry isn't technically an MC, because the song is more rock than hip-hop, because it was made by white musicians for white audiences. Those are all fair points to consider. Other people argue that Rapture deserves credit precisely because it was different, because it showed that rap could be mixed with other genres, because it introduced millions of people to hip-hop culture, because it helped normalize rap on radio and television. Also fair points. The truth, like most truths, is probably somewhere in the middle. Rapture wasn't the best representation of what hip-hop was in 1981, not by a long shot, but it was important. It was a bridge, a door opener, a conversation starter. It got people curious. And for many Americans, especially white Americans who didn't have any connection to black communities where hip-hop was thriving, it was literally the first time they'd ever heard rap music. Debbie Harry herself has talked about this over the years, and she's always been thoughtful about it. She's acknowledged that she was an outsider to hip-hop culture, that she was borrowing from something that wasn't hers. But she's also stood by the song, emphasizing that it came from a place of genuine love and respect, that she and Chris Stein wanted to celebrate hip-hop, not exploit it. In interviews decades later, Harry recalled those nights at the Mud Club and other downtown venues, watching the scene develop, feeling like she was witnessing something revolutionary. She talked about how Fab Five Freddy and other hip-hop pioneers were friends, not just sources of inspiration, and how important it was to her that the song gave them credit and visibility. She's also been honest about the limitations of her own performance on Rapture. Harry has never claimed to be a real MC, never pretended she had the technical skills that hip-hop artists had. She's described her rap on the song as more of a spoken word performance, an interpretation rather than an attempt at authentic hip-hop. That humility has helped her avoid some of the criticism that other white artists who've borrowed from black culture have faced. Chris Stein has been even more emphatic about this, pointing out that he and Harry were using their platform to amplify voices that weren't getting mainstream attention. In his view, Rapture was an act of advocacy, a way of telling the music industry and the public that hip-hop mattered, that these artists deserved to be heard. Stein has talked about how important it was to him that the song name-dropped actual hip-hop artists rather than just imitating the style without acknowledgement. That was deliberate, a way of pointing listeners toward the source, of saying, "This is cool, but here are the people who really created it." It was an attempt, however imperfect, at being respectful collaborators rather than appropriators. Over the years, both Harry and Stein have maintained friendships with many of the hip-hop pioneers they met in those downtown days. Fab Five. Freddie has remained close with them. They've appeared together at events, done interviews together, reminisced about those wild nights in early 80s New York. There's genuine affection there, genuine mutual respect, even if the larger questions about Rapture's place in hip-hop history remain complicated. What's fascinating is how the perception of Rapture has changed over time. In 1981, it was often dismissed as a novelty or a failed experiment. By the 90s, as hip-hop became the dominant force in popular music, people started looking back at Rapture differently. It became a historical artifact, a document of a specific moment when different corners of New York City's music scene collided. Music historians started including it in retrospectives about hip-hop's evolution. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame featured it in exhibits about the genre's mainstream breakthrough. New generations of musicians, both in hip-hop and rock, cited it as an influence. The very thing that had seemed so strange in 1981, a rock band doing a rap song, became completely normal by the 2000s, so normal that people had to be reminded how radical it once seemed. The music video got reassessed too, especially the appearance of Jean-Michel Basquiat. After Basquiat became famous and then died tragically young in 1988, that footage of him in the Rapture video took on new meaning. It became one of the few moving images of the artist from before he achieved fame, a glimpse of him as part of that downtown scene, just another creative person in a room full of creative people. Fab Five. Freddie's presence in the video also became more significant over time. He went on to host Yo MTV Raps, the show that really brought hip-hop to mainstream television in the late 80s. Looking back at the Rapture video, you could see the seeds of that future. See him already serving as a bridge between hip-hop culture and mainstream media. The graffiti artists in the video, many of whom were just kids from the Bronx and Brooklyn, went on to have serious art careers. That whole world that Rapture captured in 4 minutes ended up being documented and preserved in museums and galleries. The video became a historical record of a scene that was already disappearing even as it was being filmed. By the time the 21st century rolled around, Rapture had achieved something close to classic status, though not without controversy. It showed up on lists of the greatest music videos ever made. It got sampled and referenced by other artists. Weird Al Yankovic parodied it. College professors taught courses about it. It had gone from punchline to artifact to, in some circles, beloved classic. The 40th anniversary of the song in 2021 brought another wave of retrospectives and think pieces. Some writers focused on its importance as a crossover moment. Others examined its racial politics more critically. A few just celebrated it as a great pop song, regardless of its historical significance. All of these perspectives had validity, and together they showed how complicated and rich the song's legacy had become. What nobody can deny is that Rapture predicted something about music's future. The genre mixing that seemed so unusual in 1981 became standard practice. Rock bands incorporating rap elements, rappers singing, singers rapping. All of it became so common that we stopped even remarking on it. Rapture was early to that party, maybe the earliest mainstream example of it. The song also demonstrated something about cultural exchange that's still relevant. When done thoughtfully and respectfully, when there's genuine appreciation rather than mockery or exploitation, cross-cultural pollination in music can create something interesting. Rapture worked at least partly because Harry and Stein actually understood and cared about hip-hop culture. They weren't just grabbing whatever was trendy. Looking back now from a time when hip-hop is the most popular and influential genre in the world, when rap elements appear in country music and pop and rock and everything else, it's almost hard to imagine how weird Rapture seemed in 1981. It's hard to remember that people laughed at it, mocked it, dismissed it as a gimmick that would be forgotten in a month. The transformation has been complete. Hip-hop isn't alternative anymore, isn't underground, isn't a subculture, it's the mainstream. It's what dominates the charts, what influences fashion, what shapes language and culture. The kids in the suburbs and small towns are listening to rap. The suits in boardrooms are trying to figure out how to market it. The academy is teaching courses about it. It won. And Rapture, in its own weird way, was part of that victory. Not the biggest part, not the most important part, but a part nonetheless. It was a crack in the wall, a moment when the mainstream got a glimpse of something it had been ignoring, a bridge that some people crossed to discover a whole new world of music. The song also represents something about cultural exchange that's still worth thinking about. Cultural borrowing, or appropriation as we call it now, is complicated. It can be exploitative, disrespectful, harmful, but it can also be appreciative, collaborative, generative. The line between those things isn't always clear, and reasonable people can disagree about which side of the line Rapture falls on. What seems undeniable is that Harry and Stein approached hip-hop with genuine respect and curiosity. They weren't making fun of it or treating it as a joke. They weren't trying to claim they'd invented something new. They were fans sharing their enthusiasm, using their platform to shine a light on artists and a culture they genuinely loved. Whether that's enough to justify the song's existence and success is a question everyone has to answer for themselves. But they did laugh. They laughed a lot. And then, slowly, over years and decades, the laughter stopped. The song didn't go away. It became part of music history, part of hip-hop's story, part of the 80s, part of New York, part of this weird and wonderful moment when everything was changing and nobody quite knew what to make of it yet. The cultural moment that created Rapture can never be replicated. That specific intersection of punk, disco, hip-hop, new wave, visual art, graffiti, all colliding in downtown Manhattan, all feeding off each other's energy, that was unique. The city was dangerous and exciting and affordable in ways it would never be again. Artists could take risks because failure wasn't that much worse than success when everyone was broke anyway. That freedom, That willingness to experiment and cross boundaries and not worry too much about whether you were staying in your lane produced some amazing art. Rapture was one piece of it. The whole downtown scene produced work that still resonates, still influences, still matters. And one of the reasons it mattered was that nobody was overthinking it. They were just doing what felt interesting and exciting in the moment. That's the thing about being ahead of your time. Sometimes you have to wait for time to catch up, for people to understand what you were doing, for the joke to stop being funny and start being important. Rapture had to wait, but it got there. The song that everybody laughed at became the song that everybody had to respect, whether they liked it or not. And those critics who dismissed it, those radio programmers who thought it was too weird, those comedy show hosts who made it the butt of their jokes, they're forgotten now, footnotes at best. But Rapture is still here, still being discussed, still mattering to the history of popular music. That's the thing about art that matters. Time sorts it out. The stuff that's genuinely important, that captures something real about its moment or points toward the future, that stuff endures. Everything else fades away. Rapture endured, survived the laughter, survived the backlash, survived its own strangeness, and became something close to timeless. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.